Hello again, I'm B. David Sloan, and this is episode 3 of Sinclair Lewis's It Can't Happen Here. And now for a little recap of episode 2. As chapter 3 opens, we learn quite a bit more about Dreamus Jessup as Sinclair Lewis gives us a rather exhaustive look at the contents of Dreamus's study, including half of the books and all of the personal effects in his study. We learn that Dreamus has 3 grown kids, a lawyer named Philip, who went to Harvard, a housewife named Mary, who's married to the only, it seems, doctor in town, and Cecilia, also known as Sissy, who is an 18-year-old high school senior who has ambitions to go off to college and become an architect. And of course, there is the dog Foolish. Also learn a little bit more about Dreamus's politics. First of all, we learn that he's a third cousin to President Calvin Coolidge, who he has some areas of agreement and disagreement with, and he also has a signed picture of Teddy Roosevelt. And through the listing of the effects in his office, particularly the books, we get to learn a little bit about him as a thinker. And what we find is he has several books on Russia and Bolshevism, and either incredibly pro or incredibly con, which of course might lead us to believe that he is one who is willing to look at the extremes and find the truth, which always lies somewhere in the middle. We also learn that the Jessup family is wealthy enough and has a large enough property to hire 2 employees, one a delightful cook named Mrs. Candy, and the other a hired man, Mr. Fix-It, named Shad Ledoux, who is a bit, as we're going to see, disgruntled. And perhaps duly so, and you'll get a little bit of Dreamus's attitude toward his hired man, which might be the cause of some of that dissatisfaction. And lastly, in Chapter 3, we get a little bit of the plot, and we get to see what's happening outside the world of Fort Beulah when Dreamus receives a letter from an old friend, Professor Victor Loveland, who teaches the classics at Isaiah College, Dreamus's alma mater, and he tells him about the disturbing news that all of a sudden that the military has essentially set up camp on college campuses, particularly there it was Isaiah College, and what we would now see is the JROTC programs. This ties in nicely with some of the conversations from earlier in the book when we're talking about the need to firm and toughen up the young men and women of the country. And it also speaks a little bit to the encroaching fascist ideology of the population, particularly the fact that Loveland and his colleagues all are asked to sign a loyalty pledge by the university that they will not criticize this move by the government to place military orders inside of the college campuses, on penalty of being fired from the positions. Chapter 4 opens up with a conversation about the 1936 presidential election, where we learn that Franklin Delano Roosevelt will not be reelected, and in fact he will be displaced by a primary challenger by the name of Berzelius Buzz Windrip. Windrip is a populist candidate who was senator from Chicago, starts as a small-town lawyer, wins his way into politics by being a very charming panderer. The book is very clear about the fact that even though he's done some wonderful things for the state of Illinois, including quadrupling the size of its militia, which he then somehow uses to protect himself against graft and corruption charges brought against him by the state's attorney general, by ousting essentially all of his political opponents from the state. And despite his rather folksy demeanor, he is someone who is interested in power. And he has a little henchman whose name is Lee Saracen. Saracen is described as Windrip's satanic secretary, who seems to have no real political ideology, or one that has changed quite often throughout his lifetime, but he's settled currently on an oligarchical fascism. Saracen seems to go pretty well with Windrip, who is described as not a churchgoer. Windrip's economic plans to rally the folks out of the Great Depression, of course, is based on Huey Long's, longtime governor and senator from Louisiana, plan to essentially include a universal basic income for the people who are struggling, sometimes $5,000 a year, sometimes less or more. The number seems to change depending on who he's speaking to at the time. The plan also looks to cap the wealth of the top 1% at $500,000 a year, all of which Lewis suggests is a mere ploy to get people on his side. And the business leaders like Tasbrow earlier in the book talk about the fact that, yes, he talks tough about Wall Street now, but he will definitely take care of the business folks once he gets into power. Windrip's philosophy and his economic platform and plan is published in part in his autobiography, ghost-written, we believe, by Saracen, called 0 Hour, which Sinclair Lewis will use to head future chapters of the book periodically. And lastly, chapter 4 discusses the bishop of the Methodist Episcopal Church, Paul Peter Prang, who escapes laws against preaching politics from the pulpit by buying airtime on radio stations. And he's also the head of the League of Forgotten Men, an organization that is rumored to number about 27 million people. Both his radio audience and the League offer him great political power, and Doremus makes it clear that he believes that Prang is someone who is interested in power in order to shape the world according to his own ends. Prang is a supporter of Windrip's ideology, particularly his idea of the UBI, to help out the common man, all of which, of course, factors in very nicely to a conversation about fascism and people that are in power and what they do with that power, which we're going to see develop as the book continues. So that does it for our summary of episode 2 of It Can Happen Here. Starting with this episode, episode 3, we're gonna actually do the summaries at the end of the reading, which we're gonna double to about an hour in length as opposed to 30 minutes. We're also actually gonna do much shorter summaries going forward and focus a little bit more on questions about how the book that's written in 1935 relates to 2020. So without further ado, episode 3 of It Can't Happen Here by Sinclair Lewis. It Can't Happen Here, Chapter 5. I know the press only too well. Almost all editors hide away in spider dens, men without thought of family or public interest, or the humble delights of jaunts out of doors, plotting how they can put over their lies and advance their own positions and fill their greedy pocketbooks by calumniating statesmen who have given their all for the common good and who are vulnerable because they stand out in the fierce light that beats around the throne. From 0 Hour by Berzelius Windrip. The June morning shone. The last petals of the wild cherry blossoms lay dew-covered on the grass. Robins were about their brisk business on the lawn. Doremus, by nature a late liar and pilferer of naps after he had been called at 8, was stirred to spring up and stretch his arms out fully 5 or 6 times in Swedish exercises in front of his window, looking out across the Beulah River Valley to the dark masses of pine on the mountain slopes 3 miles away. Doremus and Emma had had each their own bedroom these 15 years, not altogether to her pleasure. He asserted that he couldn't share a bedroom with any person living because he was a night mutterer and liked to make a really good uprearing, pillow-slapping job of turning over in bed without feeling that he was disturbing someone. It was Saturday, the day of the Prang revelation, but on this crystal morning, after days of rain, he did not think of Prang at all, but of the fact that Philip, his son, with wife, had popped up from Worcestershire for the weekend, and that whole crew of them, along with Lorinda Pike and Buck Titus, were going to have a real old-fashioned family picnic. They had all demanded it, even the fashionable Sissy, a woman whom, at 18, had much concern with tennis tees, golf, and mysterious, appalling rapid motor trips with Malcolm Tasbrow, just graduating from high school, or with the Episcopal parson's grandson, Julian Falk, freshman in Amherst. Doremus had scolded that he couldn't go to any blame picnic. It was his job as editor to stay home and listen to Bishop Prang's broadcast at 2, but they had laughed at him and rumpled his hair and miscalled him until he had promised. They didn't know it, but he had slyly borrowed a portable radio from his friend, the local R.C. priest, Father Stephen Perfix, and he was going to hear praying whether or no. He was glad that they were going to have Lorinda Pike. He was fond of that sardonic saint, and Buck Titus, who was perhaps his closest intimate. James Buck Titus, who was 50 but looked 38, straight, broad-shouldered, slim-waisted, long-mustached, swarthy buck, was the Daniel Boone type of old American, or perhaps an Indian fighting cavalry captain out of Charles King. He had graduated from Williams with 10 weeks in England and 10 years in Montana, divided between cattle raising, prospecting, and horse breeding ranch. His father, a richish railroad contractor, had left him the great farm near West Beulah, and Buck had come back home to grow apples, to breed Morgan stallions, to read Voltaire, Anatole France, Nietzsche, and Dostoevsky. He served in the war as a private, detested his officers, refused a commission, and liked the Germans at Cologne. He was a useful polo player, but regarded riding to the hounds as childish. In politics, he did not so much yearn over the wrongs of labor as feel scornful of the tight-fisted exploiters who denned in office and stinking factory. He was as near to the English country squire as one may find in America. He was a bachelor with a big mid-Victorian house, well kept up by a friendly Negro couple. A tidy place in which he sometimes entertained ladies who were not quite so tidy. He called himself an agnostic instead of an atheist, only because he detested the street-brawling, tract-peddling evangelism of the professional atheists. He was cynical, he rarely smiled, and he was unwaveringly loyal to all the Jessops. His coming to the picnic made Doremus as blithe as his grandson David. Perhaps, even under fascism, the church clock will stand at 10 to 3, and there will be honey still for tea, Doremus hoped, as he put on his rather dandified country tweeds. The only stain on the preparations for the picnic was the grouchiness of the hired man, Shad Ledoux. When he was asked to turn the ice cream freezer, he growled, "Why the heck don't you folks get an electric freezer?" He grumbled most audibly at the weight of the picnic baskets, and when he was asked to clean up the basement during their absence, he retorted only with a glare of silent fury. "You ought to get rid of that fellow Ledoux," urged Doremus's son, Philip, the lawyer. "Oh, I don't know," considered Doremus. "Probably just shiftlessness on my part. But I tell myself I'm doing a social experiment, trying to train him to be as gracious as the average Neanderthal man. Or perhaps I'm scared of him. He's the kind of vindictive peasant that sets fires to barns. Did you know that he actually reads, Phil?" "No." "Yep. Mostly movie magazines with naked ladies and wild western stories, but he also reads the papers. Told me he greatly admired Buzz Windrip. Says Windrip will certainly be president, and then everybody, by which I'm afraid Shad means only himself, will have 5,000 a year. Buzz certainly has a bunch of philanthropists for followers." "Now listen, Dad, you don't understand Senator Windrip. He's something of a demagogue. He shoots off his mouth a lot about how he'll jack up the income tax and grab the banks, but he won't. That's just molasses for the cockroaches. What he will do, and maybe only he can do, is to protect us from the murdering, thieving, lying Bolsheviks that would, they'd like to stick all of us that are going on this picnic, all the decent, clean people that are accustomed to privacy, into hall bedrooms and make us cook our cabbage soup on a Primus stuck on a bed. Yes, or maybe liquidate us entirely. No, Sir Berzelius Windrip is the fellow to balk the dirty, sneaking Jew spies that pose as American liberals. The face is the face of my reasonably competent son, Philip, but the voice is the voice of the Jew-baiter Julius Streicher," sighed Doremus. The picnic ground was among a Stonehenge of gray and lichen-painted rocks, fronting a birch grove high up on Mount Terror, on the upland farm of Doremus's cousin, Henry Veeder, a solid, reticent Vermonter of the old days. They looked through a distant mountain gap to the faint mercury of Lake Champlain, and across it the bulwark of the Adirondacks. Davy Greenhill and his hero, Buck Titus, wrestled in the hardy pasture grass. Philip and Dr. Fowler Greenhill, Doremus's son-in-law, Phil, plump and half-bald at 32, Fowler, belligerently red-headed and red-mustached, argued about the merits of the auto-giro. Doremus lay with his head against a rock, his cap over his eyes, gazing down into the paradise of Beulah Valley. He could not have sworn to it, but he rather thought he saw an angel floating in the radiant upper air above the valley. The women, Emma and Mary Greenhill, Sissy and Philip's wife, and Lorinda Pike, were setting out the picnic lunch, a pot of beans with crisp salt pork, fried chicken, potatoes warmed over with croutons, tea biscuits, crab apple jelly, salad, raisin pie on a red and white tablecloth spread on a flat rock. But for the parked motor cars, the scene might have been New England in 1885, and you could see the women in chip hats and tight-bodiced, high-necked frocks with bustles, the men in straw boaters with dangling ribbons and adorned with side whiskers, Doremus's beard not clipped but flowing like a bridal veil. When Dr. Greenhill fetched down Cousin Henry Veeder, a bulky yet shy enough pre-Ford farmer in clean, faded overalls, then was time again unbought, secure, serene. And the conversation had a comfortable triviality and an affectionate Victorian dullness. However Doremus might fret about the conditions, however skittishly Sissy might long for the presence of her beau, Julian Falk and Malcolm Tasbro, there was nothing modern and neurotic, nothing savoring of Freud, Adler, Marx, Bertrand Russell, or any other divinity of the 1930s when Mother Emma chatted to Mary and Marilla about her rose bushes that had winter killed and the new young maples and the field mice that had gnawed them, and the difficulty of getting Shad Ledoux to bring in enough firewood, and how Shad gorged pork chops and fried potatoes and pie at lunch, which he ate at the Jessops. And the view. The women talked about the view as honeymooners once talked at Niagara Falls. David and Buck Titus were playing ship now on a rearing rock. It was the bridge, and David was Captain Popeye with Buck and his bosun. And even Dr. Greenhill, that impetuous crusader who was constantly infuriating the country board of health by reporting the slovenly state of the poor farm and the stench in the county jail, was lazy in the sun, and with the gentlest of concentration kept an unfortunate little ant running back and forth on a twig. His wife Mary, the golfer, the runner-up in state tennis tournaments, and the giver of smart but not too bibulous cocktail parties at the country club, the wearer of smart brown tweeds with a green scarf, seemed to have dropped gracefully back into the domesticity of her mother, and to consider as a very weighty thing a recipe for celery and Roquefort sandwiches on toasted soda crackers. She was the handsome, older Jessup girl again, back in the White House with the mansard roof. And Foolish, lying on his back with his 4 paws idiotically flopping, was the most pastorally old-fashioned of them all. The only serious flare of conversation was when Buck Titus snarled to Doremus, "Certainly a lot of messiahs potting at you from the bushes these days. Buzz Windrip and Bishop Prang and Father Coughlin and Dr. Townsend, though he seems to have gone back to Nazareth, and Upton Sinclair and Reverend Frank Buckman and Bernard McFadden and Willem Randolph Hearst and Governor Talmadge and Floyd Olson and say, I swear the best Messiah in the whole show is this darky Father Divine. He doesn't just promise he's going to feed the underprivileged 10 years from now. He hands out the fried drumsticks and gizzard right along with salvation. How about him for president?" Out of nowhere appeared Julian Falk. This young man, freshman in Amherst the past year, grandson of the Episcopal rector and living with the old man because his parents were dead, was in the eyes of Doremus the most nearly tolerable of Sissy's suitors. He was Swede blonde and wiry, with a neat, small face and canny eyes. He called Doremus sir, and he had, unlike most of the radio and motor hypnotized 18-year-olds in the fort, read a book and voluntarily read Thomas Wolfe and William Rawlins, John Strachey, and Stuart Chase and Ortega. Whether Sissy preferred him to Malcolm Tasbro, her father did not know. Malcolm was taller and thicker than Julian, and he drove his own streamlined DeSoto, while Julian could only borrow his grandfather's shockingly old flivver. Sissy and Julian bickered amiably about Alice Aylot's skill in backgammon, and Foolish scratched himself in the sun. But Remus was not being pastoral, he was being anxious and scientific, while the others jeered, "When does Dad take his audition? And what's he learning to be, a crooner or hockey announcer?" Remus was adjusting the doubtful portable radio. Once he thought he was going to be with them in the home sweet home atmosphere, for he tuned in on a program of old songs, and all of them, including Cousin Henry Veeder, who had hidden passion for fiddlers and barn dancers and parlor organs, hummed gaily the Troubadour and Maid of Athens and Darling Nellie Gray. But when the announcer informed them that all these ditties were being sponsored by Toily Oily, the Natural Home Cathartic, and that they were being rendered by a sextet of young males horribly called the Smoothies, Remus abruptly shut them off. "Why, what the matter, Dad?" cried Sissy. "Smoothies? God, this country deserves what it's going to get," snapped Remus. "Maybe we need a Buzz Windrip." The moment, then, it should have been announced by cathedral chimes, of the weekly address of Bishop Paul Peter Prang. Coming from an airless closet, smelling of sacerdotal woolen union suits in Persepolis, Indiana, it leapt to the farthest stars. It circled the world at 186,000 miles a second, 1,000,000 miles while you stopped to scratch. It crashed into the cabin of a whaler on a dark polar sea, into an office paneled with linen-fold oak looted from a Nottinghamshire castle on the 67th story of a building on Wall Street, into the Foreign Office in Tokyo, into the rocky hollow below the shining birches upon Mount Terror in Vermont. Bishop Prang spoke as he usually did, with a grave kindliness, a virile resonance, which made his self magically coming to them on the unseen aerial pathway, at once dominating and touched with charm, and whatever his purposes might be, his words were on the side of the angels. "My friends of the radio audience, I shall have but 6 more weekly petitions to make you before the national conventions which will decide the fate of this distraught nation. And the time has come now to act enough of words. Let me put together certain separated phrases out of the 6th chapter of Jeremiah, which seem to have been prophetically written for this hour of desperate crisis in America. O ye children of Benjamin, gather yourselves together to flee out of the midst of Jerusalem. Prepare ye war, rise, and let us go up at noon. Woe unto us, for the day goeth away, for the shadows of the evening are stretched out. Arise, and let us go by night, and let us destroy her palaces. I am full of the fury of the Lord, I am weary with holding it in. I will pour it out upon the children abroad, and upon the assembly of young men together, for even the husband with the wife shall be taken, the aged with him that is full of days. I will stretch out my hand upon the inhabitants of this land, saith the Lord, from the very least of them even unto the greatest. Every one is given to covetousness, and from the prophet even unto the priest, every one dealeth falsely, saying, Peace, peace, when there is no peace. So spake the book of old, but it was spoken also to America of 1936. There is no peace. For more than a year now, the League of Forgotten Men has warned the politicians, the whole government, that we are sick unto death of being the dispossessed, and that, at last, we are more than 50 million strong, no whimpering horde, but with the will, the voices, the votes to enforce our sovereignty. We have in no uncertain way informed every politician that we demand certain measures, and that we will brook no delay. Again and again we have demanded that both the control of credit and the power to issue money be unqualifiedly taken away from the private banks, that the soldiers not only receive the bonus
they with their blood and anguish so richly earned in 17 and 18, but that the amount agreed upon be now doubled, that all swollen incomes be severely limited, inheritance cut to such small sums as may support the heirs only in youth and in old age, that labor and farmers' unions be not merely recognized as instruments for joint bargaining, but be made, like the syndicates in Italy, official parts of the government representing the toilers, and that international Jewish finance and equally international Jewish communism and anarchism and atheism be, with all the stern solemnity and rigid inflexibility this great nation can show, barred from all activity. Those of you who have listened to me before will understand that I, or rather the League of Forgotten Men, has no quarrel with individual Jews, that we are proud to have rabbis among our directors, but those subversive international organizations which unfortunately are so largely Jewish must be driven with whips and scorpions from off the face of the earth. These demands we have made, and how long now, O Lord, how long have the politicians and the smirking representatives of big business pretended to listen, to obey? Yes, yes, my masters of the League of the Forgotten Men. Yes, we understand. Just give us time. There is no more time. Their time is over in all their unholy power. The conservative senators, the United States Chamber of Commerce, the giant bankers, the monarchs of steel and motors and electricity and coal, the brokers and the holding companies, they are all of them like the Bourbon kings, of whom it was said that they forgot nothing and they learned nothing. But they died upon the guillotine. Perhaps we can be more merciful to our Bourbons, but perhaps we can save them from the guillotine, the gallows, the swift firing squad. Perhaps we shall, in our new regime, under our new constitution, with our new deal that really will be a new deal and not an arrogant experiment, perhaps we shall make these big bugs of finance and politics sit on hard chairs in dingy offices, toiling unending hours with pen and typewriter, as so many white-collar slaves for so many years have toiled for them. It is, as Senator Berzelius Windrip puts it, the 0 hour. Now, this second. We have stopped bombarding the heedless heirs of the false masters. We're going over the top. At last, after months and months of taking counsel together, the directors of the League of Forgotten Men and I myself announced that in the coming Democratic National Convention we shall, with one smallest reservation. Listen, listen! History being made, Dreamus cried at his heedless family. Use the tremendous strength of the millions of League members to secure the Democratic presidential nomination for Senator Berzelius Windrip, which means flatly that he will be elected and that we of the League shall elect him as President of these United States. His program and that of the League do not in all details agree, but he has implicitly pledged himself to take our advice, and at least until election we shall back him absolutely with our money, with our loyalty, with our votes, with our prayers. And may the Lord guide him and us across the desert of iniquitous politics and swinishly grasping finance into the golden glory of the promised land. God bless you. Mrs. Jessup said cheerily, Why, Dormouse, that bishop isn't a fascist at all. He's a regular red radical. But does this announcement of his mean anything, really? Oh well, Dreamus reflected. He had lived with Emma for 34 years, and not oftener than once or twice a year had he wanted to murder her. Blandly he said, Why, nothing much except that in a couple of years now, on the ground of protecting us, the Buzz Windrip dictatorship will be regimenting everything from where we may pray to what detective stories we may read. Sure he will. Sometimes I'm tempted to turn communist myself. Funny, me with my Fat-headed old Hudson River Valley Dutch ancestors, marveled Julian Falk. Fine idea. Out of the frying pan of Windrip and Hitler into the fire of the New York Daily Worker and Stalin and automatics. And the 5-year plan, I suppose they'll tell me it's been decided by the commissar that each of my mares is to bear 6 colts a year now, snorted Buck Titus, while Dr. Fowler Greenhill jeered, "Aw, shoot, Dad, and you too, Julian, you young paranoiac, you're monomaniac's dictatorship. Better come into the office and let me examine your heads. Why, America's the only free nation on earth. Besides, country's too big for a revolution. No, no, couldn't happen here." End of chapter 5. It can't happen here. Chapter 6. I'd rather follow a wild-eyed anarchist like M. Goldman if they'd bring more Johnny Cake and beans and spuds into the humble cabin of the common man than a 24-carat college graduate ex-cabinet member statesman that was just interested in our turning out more limousines. Call me a socialist or any blamed thing you want to, as long as you grab hold of the other end of the cross-cut saw with me and help slash the big logs of poverty and intolerance to pieces. 0 Hour by Berzelius Windrip. His family, at least his wife and the cook Mrs. Candy and Sissy and Mary and Mrs. Fowler Greenhill, believed that Doremus was of fickle health, that any cold would surely turn into pneumonia, that he must wear his rubbers and eat his porridge and smoke fewer cigarettes and never overdo. He raged at them. He knew that though he did get staggeringly tired after a crisis in the office, a night's sleep made him a little dynamo again, and he could turn out copy faster than his spryest young reporter. He concealed his dissipations from them like any small boy from his elders, lied unscrupulously about how many cigarettes he smoked, kept a concealed flask of bourbon from which he regularly had one nip, only one, before he padded to bed, and when he had promised to go to sleep early, he turned off his light till he was sure that Emma was slumbering, and then turned it on and happily read till 2, curled under the well-beloved hand-woven blankets from the loom up on Mount Terror, his legs twitching like a dreaming setter's what time the chief inspector of the CID, alone and unarmed, walked into the counterfeiter's hideout. And once a month or so he sneaked down to the kitchen at 3 in the morning and made himself coffee and washed up everything so that Emma and Mrs. Candy would never know. He thought they never knew. These small deceptions gave him the ripest satisfaction in life, otherwise devoted to public service, to trying to make Shad Ledoux edge up the flower beds, to feverishly writing editorials that would excite 3% of his readers from breakfast time till noon, and by 6 p.m. be eternally forgotten. Sometimes when Emma came to loaf beside him in bed on a Sunday morning and put her comfortable arm around his thin shoulder blades, she was sick with the realization that he was growing older and more frail. His shoulders, she thought, were pathetic, as those of an anemic baby. That sadness of hers, Doremus never guessed. Even just before the paper went to press, even when Shad Ledoux took off 2 hours and charged an item of $2 to have the lawnmower sharpened instead of filing it himself, even when Sissy and her gang played the piano downstairs till 2 on nights when he did not want to lie awake, Doremus was never irritable, except usually between a rising and the first life-saving cup of coffee. The wise Emma was happy when he was snappish before breakfast. It meant that he was energetic and popping with satisfactory ideas. After Bishop Prang had presented the crown to Senator Windrip as the summer hobbled nervously toward the national political conventions, Emma was disturbed. For Doremus was silent before breakfast, and he had rheumy eyes, as though he was worried, as though he had slept badly. Never was he cranky. She missed hearing him croaking, "Isn't that confounded idiot, Mrs. Candy, ever going to bring in the coffee? I suppose she's sitting there reading her testament. And will you be so kind as to tell me, my good woman, why Sissy never gets up for breakfast, even after the rare nights when she goes to bed at 1 a.m.? And will you look out at that walk covered with dead blossoms. That swine Shad hasn't swept it for a week. I swear I am going to fire him, and right away this morning." Emma would have been happy to hear these familiar animal sounds and to cluck an answer, "Oh, why, that's just terrible. I'll go tell Mrs. Candy to hustle in the coffee right away." But he sat unspeaking, pale, opening his Daily Informer as though he were afraid to see what news had come in since he had left the office at 10. When Doremus, back in the 1920s, had advocated the recognition of Russia, Fort Beulah had fretted that he was turning out and out communist. He, who understood himself abnormally well, knew that far from being a left-wing radical, he was at most a mild, rather indolent and somewhat sentimental liberal who disliked pomposity, the heavy humor of public men, and the itch for notoriety which made popular preachers and eloquent educators and amateur play producers and rich lady reformers and rich lady sportswomen and almost every brand of rich lady come preeningly in to see newspaper editors with photographs under their arms and on their faces the simper of fake humility. But for all cruelty and intolerance and for the contempt of the fortunate and for the unfortunate, he had not mere dislike, but testy hatred. He had alarmed all his fellow editors in northern New England by asserting the innocence of Tom Mooney, questioning the guilt of Sacco and Vanzetti, condemning our intrusion in Haiti and Nicaragua, advocating an increased income tax, writing in the 1932 campaign a friendly account of the socialist candidate Norman Thomas, and afterwards, to tell the truth, voting for Franklin Roosevelt, and stirring up a little local and ineffective hell regarding the serfdom of the southern sharecroppers and the California fruit pickers. He even suggested editorially that when Russia had her factories and railroads and giant farms really going, say, in 1945, she might conceivably be the pleasantest country in the world for the mythical average man. When he wrote that editorial after lunch at which he had been irritated by the smug croaking of Frank Tasbro and R.C. Crowley, he really did get into trouble. He got named Bolshevik, and in 2 days his paper lost 150 out of its 5,000 circulation. Yet he was as little of a Bolshevik as Herbert Hoover. He was, and he knew it, a small-town bourgeois intellectual. Russia forbade everything that made his toil worth enduring: privacy, the right to think and to criticize as he freakishly pleased, to have his mind policed by peasants in uniform rather than that he would live in an Alaskan cabin with beans and 100 books and a new pair of pants every 3 years. Once on a motor trip with Emma, he stopped in a summer camp of communists. Most of them were city college Jews or neat Bronx dentists, spectacled and smooth-shaven except for foppish small mustaches. They were hot to welcome these New England peasants and to explain the Marxian gospel, on which, however, they furiously differed. Over macaroni and cheese in an unpainted dining shack, they longed for the black bread of Moscow. Later, Doremus chuckled to find how much they resembled the YMCA campers 20 miles down the highway, equally puritanical, hortatory, and futile, and equally given to silly games with rubber balls. Once only had he been dangerously active. He had supported the strike for union recognition against the quarry company of Francis Tasbro, men whom Doremus had known for years, solid cits like Superintendent of Schools Emil Staubmeyer and Charlie Betts of the furniture store had muttered about riding him out of town on a rail. Tasbro reviled him even now, 8 years later. After all this, the strike had been lost, and the strike leader, an avowed communist named Karl Pascal, had gone to prison for inciting to violence. When Pascal, best of mechanics, came out, he went to work in a littered little Fort Beulah garage owned by a friendly, loquacious, belligerent Polish socialist named John Polycop. All day long, Pascal and Polycop yelpingly raided each other's trenches in the battle between social democracy and communism, and Doremus often dropped in to stir them up. That was hard for Tasbro, Staubmeyer, banker Crowley, and lawyer Kitterick to bear. If Doremus had not come from 3 generations of debt-paying Vermonters, he would by now have been a penniless wandering printer, and possibly less detached about the sorrows of the dispossessed. The conservative Emma complained, "How can you tease people this way, pretending you're really like greasy mechanics like this Pascal, and I suspect you even have a sneaking fondness for Shad Ledoux, when you could just associate with decent, prosperous people like Frank? It's beyond me what they must think of you sometimes. They don't understand that you're really not a socialist one, but really a nice, kind-hearted, responsible man. Oh, I ought to smack you, Dormouse." Not that he liked being called Dormouse, but then no one did so except Emma, and in rare slips of the tongue, Buck Titus. So it was endurable. End of chapter 6. It Can't Happen Here, chapter 7. When I am protestingly dragged from my study in the family hillside into public meetings that I so much detest, I try to make my speech as simple and direct as those of the child Jesus talking to the doctors in the temple. 0 hour, Berzelius Windrip. Thunder in the mountains, clouds marching down the Beulah Valley, unnatural darkness covering the world like black fog, and lightning that picked out ugly scarps of the hills as though they were rocks thrown up in an explosion. To such fury of the enraged heavens Doremus awakened on that morning of late July, as abruptly as one who, in the death cell, startles out of the sleep to the realization, "Today they'll hang me." He sat up, bewildered, as he reflected that today Senator Berzelius Windrip would probably be nominated for president. The Republican convention was over, with Walt Trowbridge as presidential candidate. The Democratic convention, meeting in Cleveland with a good deal of gin, strawberry soda, and sweat, had finished the committee reports, the kind words said for the flag, the assurances to the ghost of Jefferson that he would be delighted by what, if Chairman Jim Farley consented, would be done here this week. They had come to the nominations. Senator Windrip had been nominated by Colonel Dewey Hake, congressman and power in the American Legion. Gratifying applause and hasty elimination had greeted such favorite sons of the several states as Al Smith, Carter Glass, William McAdoo, and Cordell Hull. Now, on the 20th ballot, there were 4 contestants left, and they, in order of votes, were Senator Windrip, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, Senator Robinson of Arkansas, and Secretary of Labor Francis Perkins. Great and dramatic shenanigans had happened in Doremus Jessup's imagination, had seen them all clearly as they were reported by the hysterical radio and by bulletins from the AP that fell red-hot and smoking upon his desk at the Informer office. In honor of Senator Robinson, the University of Arkansas brass band marched in behind a leader riding an old horse-drawn buggy which was plastered with great placards proclaiming, "Save the Constitution" and "Robinson for Sanity." The name of Miss Perkins had been cheered for 2 hours, while the delegates marched with their state banners, and President Roosevelt's name had been cheered for 3, cheered affectionately and quite homicidally, since every delegate knew that Mr. Roosevelt and Miss Perkins were far too lacking in circus tinsel and general clownishness to succeed at this critical hour of the nation's hysteria, when the electorate wanted a ringmaster revolutionist like Senator Windrip. Windrip's own demonstrations, scientifically worked up beforehand by his secretary, press agent, private philosopher Lee Saracen, yielded nothing to others, for Saracen had read his Chesterton well enough to know that there is only one thing bigger than a very big thing, and that is a thing so very small that it can be seen and understood. When Colonel Dewey Hake put Buzz's name in the nomination, the colonel wound up by shouting, "One thing more! Listen! It is the special request of Senator Windrip that you do not waste the time of this historic-making assembly by any cheering of his name, any cheering whatever. We of the League of Forgotten Men, yes, and women, don't want empty acclaim, but a solemn consideration of the desperate and immediate need of 60% of the population of the United States. No cheers, but may Providence guide us in the most solemn thinking we have ever done." As he finished, down the center aisle came a private procession, but this was no parade of thousands. There were only 31 persons in it, and the only banners were 3 flags and 2 large placards. Leading it in old blue uniforms were 2 GAR veterans, and between, arm in arm with them, a Confederate in gray. They were such very old men, all over 90, leaning on one another and glancing timidly about in the hope that no one would laugh at them. The Confederate carried a Virginia regimental banner torn as by shrapnel, and one of the Union veterans lifted high a slashed flag of the 1st Minnesota. The dutiful applause which the convention had given to the demonstrators of other candidates had been but rain patter compared with the tempest which greeted the 3 shaking, shuffling old men. On the platform the band played inaudibly Dixie, and then when Johnny Comes Marching Home, and standing on his chair midway of the auditorium as a plain member of his state delegation, Buzz Windrip bowed, and tried to smile, while tears started from his eyes and he sobbed helplessly, and the audience began to sob with him. Following the old men were 12 legionnaires wounded in 1918, stumbling on wooden legs, dragging themselves between crutches, one in a wheelchair, yet so young-looking and gay, and one with a black mask before what should have been a face. Of these, one carried an enormous flag, and another a placard demanding, "Our starving families must have the bonus. We want only justice. We want Buzz for president." And leading them, not wounded, but upright and strong and resolute, was Major General Herman Meinecke, United States Army. Not in all the memory of older reporters had a soldier on active service ever appeared as a public political agitator. The press whispered one to another, "That general will get canned unless Buzz is elected. Then he'd probably be made Duke of Hoboken." Following the soldiers were 10 men and women, their toes through their shoes, and wearing rags that were more pitiful because they had been washed and rewashed till they had lost all color. With them tottered 4 pallid children, their teeth rotted out, between them just managing to hold up a placard declaring, "We are on relief. We want to become human beings again. We want Buzz." 20 feet behind came one lone tall man. The delegates had been craning around to see what would follow the relief victims. When they did see, they rose, they bellowed, they clapped for the lone man. Few of the crowd had seen him in the flesh. All of them had seen him 100 times in press pictures, photographed among litters of books in his study, photographed in conference with President Roosevelt and Secretary Ikes, photographed shaking hands with Senator Windrip, photographed before a microphone, his shrieking mouth a dark open trap, and his lean right arm thrown up in hysterical emphasis. All of them had heard his voice on the radio till they knew it as they knew the voices of their own brothers. All of them recognized, coming through the wide main entrance at the end of the Windrip parade, the apostle of the forgotten men, Bishop Paul Peter Prang. Then the convention cheered Buzz Windrip for 4 unbroken hours. In the detailed descriptions of the conventions which the news bureaus sent following the feverish first bulletins, one energetic Birmingham reporter pretty well proved that the Southern battle flag carried by the Confederate veteran had been lent by the museum in Richmond, and the Northern flag by a distinguished meat packer of Chicago who was the grandson of a Civil War general. Lee Saracen never told anyone save Buzz Windrip that both flags had been manufactured on Hester Street's New York in 1929 for the patriotic drama Morgan's Riding, and that both came from a theatrical warehouse. Before the cheering as Windrip parade neared the platform, they were greeted by Miss Adelaide Tarr Gimmich, the celebrated author, lecturer, and composer who suddenly conjured onto the platform as if whisked out of the air, sang to the tune of Yankee Doodle, words which she herself had written. Berzelius Windrip went to Washington, riding on a hobby, to throw big business out by gosh and be the people's lobby. Buzz and keep it up, our cares and needs he's toting. You are most ungrateful pup, unless for Buzz you're voting. The League of the Forgotten Men don't like to be forgotten. They went to Washington and then they sang There's Something Rotten. That joyous battle song was sung on the radio by 19 different prima donnas before midnight, by some 16 million less vocal Americans within 48 hours, and by at least 90 million friends and scoffers in the struggle that was to come. All through the campaign, Buzz Windrip was able to get lots of jolly humor out of puns on going to Washington and to wash, and Walt Trowbridge, he jeered, wasn't going to either of them. Yet Lee Saracen knew that in addition to his comic masterpiece, the cause of Windrip required an anthem more elevated in thought and spirit, befitting the seriousness of crusading Americans. Long after the convention's cheering for Windrip had ended and the delegates were again at their proper business of saving the nation and cutting one another's throats, Saracen had Mrs. Gimmich sing a more inspirational hymn with words by Saracen himself in collaboration with a quite remarkable surgeon, one Dr. Hector McGoblin. This Dr. McGoblin, soon to become a national monument, was as accomplished in syndicated medical journalism, in the reviewing of books about education and psychoanalysis, and preparing glosses upon the philosophies of Hegel, Professor Gunther, Houston Stewart Chamberlain, and Lothrop Stoddard, in the rendition of Mozart on the violin, in the semi-professional boxing, and in the composition of epic poetry, as he was in the practice of medicine. Dr. McGoblin, what a man. The Saracen-McGoblin ode, entitled Bring Out the Old-Time Musket, became to Buzz Windrip's band of liberators what Giovanezza was to the Italians, the Horst Wessel song to the Nazis, the International to all Marxians. Along with the convention, the radio millions heard Miss Adelaide Tarr Gimmich's contralto, rich as peat, chanting, Dear Lord, we have sinned, we have slumbered, and our flag lies stained in the dust, and the souls of the past are calling, calling, arise from your sloth, you must. Lead us, O soul of Lincoln, inspire us, spirit of Lee, to rule all the world for righteousness, to fight for the right, to awe with our might, as we did in 63. See youth with desire heart glowing, see maiden with fearless eye, leading our ranks, thunder the tanks, aeroplanes cloud the sky. Bring out the old-time muskets, rouse up the old-time fire. See all the world is crumbling, dreadful and dark and dire. America, rise and conquer the world to our heart's desire. Great showmanship. P.T. Barnum or Flo Ziegfeld never put on a better, mused Doremus, as he studied the AP flimsies, as he listened to the radio he had temporarily installed in his office, and much later, when Buzz gets in, he won't be having any parade of wounded soldiers. That'll be bad fascist psychology. All those poor devils he'll hide away in institutions and just bring out the lively young human slaughter cattle in uniforms. The thunderstorm, which had mercifully lulled, burst again in with wrathful menace. All afternoon the convention balloted, over and over, with no change in order of votes for the presidential candidate. Toward 6, Miss Perkins' manager threw her votes to Roosevelt, who gained then on Senator Windrip. They seemed to have settled down to an all-night struggle, and at 10 in the evening, Doremus wearily left the office. He did not, tonight, want the sympathetic and extremely feminized atmosphere of his home, and he dropped in at the rectory of his friend Father Perfix. There he found a satisfyingly unfeminized, untalcumized group. The Reverend Mr. Falk was there. Swart, sturdy young Perfix and silvery old Falk often worked together, were fond of each other and agreed upon the advantage of clerical celibacy in almost every other doctrine except the supremacy of Bishop of Rome. With them were Buck Titus, Lewis Rottenstern, Dr. Fowler Greenhill, and banker Crowley, a financier who liked to cultivate an appearance of free intellectual discussion, though only after the hours devoted to refusing credit to desperate farmers and storekeepers. And not to be forgotten was Foolish the dog, who that thunderous morning had suspected his master's worry, followed him to the office, and all day long had growled at Hake and Saracen and Mrs. Gimmich on the radio, and showed an earnest conviction that he ought to chew up all flimsies reporting the convention. Better than his own glacial white-paneled drawing-room with its portraits of dead Vermonter worthies, Dreamus liked Father Parafix's little study in its combination of churchliness, of freedom from commerce, at least ordinary commerce, as displayed in a crucifix and plaster statuette of the Virgin and a shrieking red and green Italian picture of the Pope, with practical affairs as shown in the oak-rolled top desk and steel filing cabinet and well-worn portable typewriter. It was a pious hermit's cave with the advantages of leather chairs and excellent rye highballs. The night passed as the 8 of them, for Foolish too had his tipple of milk, all sipped and listened. The night passed as the convention bowed furiously, unavailingly, that Congress 600 miles away, 600 miles of befogged night, yet with every speech, every derisive yelp coming into the priest's cabinet in the same second in which they were heard in the hall at Cleveland. Father Parafix's housekeeper, who was 65 years old to his 39, to the disappointment of all the scandal-loving local Protestants, came in with scrambled eggs, cold beer. When my dear wife was still among us, she used to send me to bed at midnight, sighed Dr. Falk. My wife does now, said Doremus. So would mine, I bet you, if I had one, said Lewis Rottenstern derisively. Father Steve here and I are the only guys with a sensible way of living, crowed Buck Titus. Celibates, we can go to bed with our pants on or not go to bed at all. And Father Parafix murmured, But it's curious, Buck, what people find to boast of. You that you're free of God's tyranny, and also that you can go to bed in your pants, and Mr. Falk and Dr. Greenhill and I that God is so lenient with us that on some nights he lets us off from sick calls, and we can go to bed with him off. And Lewis, because, well, wait, listen, sounds like business. Colonel Dewey Hake, Buzz's proposer, was announcing that Senator Winthrop felt it would be only modest of him to go to his hotel now, but he had left a letter which he, Hake, would read, and he did read it inexorably. Winthrop stated that just in case anyone did not completely understand his platform, he wanted to make it all ringingly clear. Summarized, the letter explained that he was all against the banks, but for all 4 of the bankers, except the Jewish bankers, who were to be driven out of finance entirely, that he had thoroughly tested but unspecified plans to make all wages very high and the prices of everything produced by these same highly paid workers very low, that he was 100% for labor, but 100% against any and all strikes, and that he was in favor of the United States so arming itself, so preparing to produce its own coffee, sugar, perfumes, tweeds, and nickel instead of importing them, that it could defy the world, and maybe if the world was so impertinent as to defy America in turn, Buzz hinted he might have to take it over and run it properly. Each moment the brassy importunities of the radio seemed to Dreamus the more offensive, while the hillside slept in a heavy summer night, and he thought about the mazurka of the fireflies, the rhythm of the crickets, like the rhythm of the revolving earth itself, the voluptuous breezes that bore away the stink of cigars and sweat and whiskey breath, and mint chewing gum that seemed to come to them from the convention over the sound waves along with the oratory. It was after dawn, and Father Parafix, unclerically stripped to shirt sleeves and slippers, had just brought them in a grateful tray of onion soup with a gob of hamburger steak for Foolish, when the opposition to Buzz collapsed, and hastily, on the next ballot, Senator Berzelius Windrip was nominated as Democratic candidate for President of the United States. Doremus, Buctitis, Parafix, and Falk were for a time too gloomy for speech, so possibly was the dog foolish as well, for at the turning off of the radio he tail-thumped in only the most tentative way. R.C. Crowley gloated, "Well, all my life I've voted Republican, but here's a man that, well, I'm going to vote for that Windrip." Father Parafix said tartly, "And I've voted Democrat ever since I came from Canada and got naturalized, but this time I'm going to vote Republican. What about you fellows?" Rottenstern was silent. He did not like Windrip's reference to Jews. The ones he knew best know they were Americans. Lincoln was his tribal god, too, he vowed. "Me? I'll vote for Walt Trowbridge, of course," growled Buck. "So will I," said Doremus. "No, I won't either. Trowbridge won't have a chance. I think I'll indulge in the luxury of being independent for once and vote Prohibition or the Battle Creek brand and spinach ticket or anything that makes some sense." It was after 7 that morning when Doremus came home, and remarkably enough, Shad Ledoux, who was supposed to go to work at 7, was at work at 7. Normally, he never left his bachelor shack in Lower Town till 10 to 8, but this morning he was on the job chopping kindling. "Oh, yes," reflected Doremus, "that probably explained it. Kindling chopping, if practiced early enough, would wake up everyone in the house." Shad was tall and hulking. His shirt was sweat-stained, and as usual he needed to shave. Foolish growled at him. Doremus suspected that at some time he had been kicking Foolish. He wanted to honor Shad for the sweaty shirt, the honest toil, and all the rugged virtues, but even as a liberal American humanitarian, Doremus found it hard always to keep up with the Longfellow's village blacksmith-cum-Marx attitude consistently, and not sometimes backslide into a belief that there must be some crooks and swine among the toilers, as notoriously there were so shockingly many among persons with more than $3,500 a year. "Well, been sitting up listening to the radio," purred Doremus. "Did you know that the Democrats have nominated Senator Windrip?" "That so?" Chad growled. "Yes, just now. How are you planning to vote?" "Well, now, I'll tell you, Mr. Jessup." Shad struck an attitude, leaning on his axe. Sometimes he could be quite pleasant and condescending, even to this little man who was so ignorant about coon hunting and the games of craps and poker. "I'm gonna vote for Buzz Windrip. He's gonna fix it so everybody will get $4,000 immediate, and I'm gonna start a chicken farm. I can make a bunch of money out of chickens. I'll show some of these guys that they think they're so rich." "But Chad, you didn't have so much luck with chickens when you tried to raise them in the shed back there. I'm afraid you sort of let the water freeze up on them in the winter and they all died. You remember?" "Oh, them? So what, heck. There was too few of them. I'm not going to waste my time fooling with just a couple of dozen chickens. When I get 5,000-6,000 of them to make it worth my while, then I'll show you. You bet." Most patronizingly, "Buzz Windrip is okay." "I'm glad he has your imprimatur." "Huh?" said Shad, and scowled. But as Doremus plodded up the back porch, he heard from Shad a faint derisive, "Okay, Chief." End of Chapter 7.